Hi, this is Counselor Bukowski, and in this video we're going to be looking at the middle and southern colonies. In the previous screencast we did look at the New England colonies, so if you need to see that, just refer back to a previous video. So at this point, we have the Dutch in what is today modern New Jersey as well as parts of eastern New York State, and this formed what was known as New Netherlands. Keep in mind, as we've been saying multiple times here, that the Dutch are very much about making money off of the trade, specifically the fur trade, as this is going to be very lucrative. And they're not really all that much concerned about making military defenses, or even making it for only, certain types of people based on, being Dutch people or whatever. But nevertheless, the Dutch is a very diverse colony. As you'll see in the New Netherlands, it is characterized by having friendlier relations with the Native Americans. Again, this is a heck of a lot different from the English, who seem to constantly be getting into conflicts with Native Americans and being rather homogeneous, whereas, of course, the New Netherlands colony is going to be much more heterogeneous in a variety of forms. But you'll note that this is highly problematic for the English because they are splitting the English colonies, particularly in the South and New England. So the English are going to sort of see the Dutch as these rather weak and easy colonies to take over. And of course, since they're sandwiching the two major regions of the English colonies, this is going to be very, very troublesome. So consequently, the English are going to take it over with the use of the Duke of York, hence the modern name New York, taking his surname. And the Dutch are not going to put up much of a fight. A treaty is signed. You don't even really have a bullet fired. And now the Duke of York is now in charge, who will become the proprietor, where New York would eventually become the royal colony. Now, what's interesting about this is that New Jersey will actually be its own place eventually. It was a royal colony, and then it's going to actually be split up between East and West Jersey, and then eventually it'll become New Jersey again. But it's really interesting to think that New Jersey is going to be split up between East and West. And if you're from New Jersey, of course, you know that there's not really an East-West divide as much as there is with the northern-southern divide, what you have today. No one's going to really say that they're from East Jersey, West Jersey. That just is not a term said anymore. But maybe if you're living back then, it certainly was. All right, so William Penn, you may have heard of him. He, of course, is going to be the founder of Pennsylvania, and he is a Quaker, a very devout Quaker who's going to be believing in pacifism. And he does not really see a place for Quakers in England. Note, of course, that they're dressing plainly. They believe everyone has an inner light. They believe in equality and cooperation. And believe it or not, they are going to be harassed for these rather radical views. Especially what's interesting about this is because the English are a dominant power throughout the world. They are taking colonies all over the world, left and right. And this is going to contrast with these sort of kumbaya type of viewpoints that Penn is going to have. And sometimes the Pennsylvania colony gets this kumbaya feel or this idealistic feel that everything is fantastic. That's not entirely true, although they did have those ideals. But Pennsylvania meaning wood, so Penn's Woods, if you will, is of course going to grab his namesake. So Penn's father actually had been an admiral for the British Navy, and the king at that point, being Charles II, actually owed him money. So in 1680, King Charles II is actually going to try to repay that debt to Penn by giving him a land grant in what is of course known today as Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, if you will. So Penn is going to set up this holy experiment. Every male settler gets 50 acres of land. They get the right to vote, and you even now have freedom of religion. So certainly tolerance is going to be a little bit more compared to the other colonies, especially amongst the English. And of course, Philadelphia will be the capital, meaning the city of brotherly love. But for William Penn, right, he's going to believe that people approached in friendship are going to respond in friendship. And he's going to try to come about this with the Native Americans, right? They're going to regulate trade. They're going to have a court that is going to at least attempt to settle differences. That is not biased. I don't know how true that would be, but idealistic again. And what's impressive is that you have 50 years of no major conflicts. Again, keep in mind what's going on in the English with the in the New England colonies, as there is going to be conflict after conflict. But keep in mind that even though there are no major conflicts, the natives are still infected. They're affected by European disease, and they're also going to be continue to be pushed west due to European encroachments on the land. So again, Pennsylvania was not this ideal place that it's really made out to be. Certainly it was better than other colonies, but it's not this ideal place that is sometimes given to it. So let's get into the southern colonies. And you'll note here we have Virginia, that's the royal colony that comes about. And then the major one is going to be in Maryland. And this is granted in 1632 as a proprietary colony. And Henry VIII, if you recall, couldn't get a male heir, and as a result had to form his own church of England, which is going to be Protestant. And Catholics are sort of casted to the wayside. And despite the fact that the king has just changed the country from being Catholic to Protestant, you still have a lot of people who still want to be Catholic, and they are going to be persecuted. So a colony is going to be granted in the form of Maryland, which is going to be seen as a safe haven for Catholics who won't be persecuted. And Cecil Calvert, otherwise known as Lord Calvert, is going to be given control of this colony. And again, this will be a haven for Catholics. So this is a very important, and this is the first major enclave, if you will, for Catholics, whereas the rest of the southern colonies that we'll look at are royal colonies. This is the one proprietary colony that will be set up in the southern region. Now, with the English Civil War, this is also important to keep in mind in terms of context. Charles II, back in England, after the English Civil War, is going to create the restoration of the monarchy, and he's going to try to repay certain nobles for their help in winning the Civil War. And how is he going to repay them? He's going to be granting them land grants. Guess where? On the south along the east coast of North America. And this will be what, of course, is today the Carolinas and Georgia. So if we look at the settlement map, you'll note that you have, of course, Jamestown that's going to eventually pop up. You're going to eventually have other ones popping up as well. And this is going to be a great opportunity for these land grants to be given. And Charles II is going to say, this will be an attractive place for people who helped me out during the Civil War, so why not do that? So with the Carolinas, Charles II is thinking rather smartly. You've got the Spanish in Florida, and you need a buffer between them. And that is what is very important, especially for Georgia that we have today. But Georgia is going to be important along with having the southern buffer, having people here, because remember, back in Virginia, you have brown gold, aka tobacco. We have this flourishing settlement, and again, we don't want any encroachments of the Spaniards in these precious colonies. So he's going to be smart in providing these land grants to the nobles who helped him out, but is also going to, of course, provide him with a buffer. So the Carolinas were a proprietary colony that are going to be split into two, but keep in mind these two colonies could not be, more different other than sharing a name and a common origin. But nevertheless, in terms of South Carolina, Charlestown is going to be formed in 1670 by descendants of Englishmen who actually colonized Barbados. So they are going to come up from Barbados to South Carolina, and they're going to bring with them culture and a way of life that had developed the island of Barbados. Namely, Barbados is very much dependent upon slavery for rum and sugar. So not only is this going to be exported, this culture is going to be exported. So when it comes to, while South Carolina is going to have its own form of agriculture, what really they're going to bring with them is this slave-holding culture. So South Carolina is going to be one of those states, eventually during the Civil War by 1861, that is going to be a majority of the population being slaves. Now, in terms of agriculture, rice growing will take over. This is very labor-intensive, and of course, they're going to need the help of the African slaves to make it profitable in South Carolina. So in many ways, it's modeling South Carolina, a lot of the culture in the Barbados. And here's a little bit of a closer look here about the distance, about 2,000 miles. But even though, again, it is closer than the Chesapeake, a lot of this, that's how culture is exported. And they're going to bring that, especially that idea of using slaves. Not to say that that wasn't a foreign idea, but nevertheless. So, looking at North Carolina, Again, this is going to be settled by Virginians who are going to bring their sort of Virginia flavor here. Now, remember in Virginia from previous screencasts that in Virginia they could not make a decision without the House of Burgesses. So that's a seat of democracy right there. And of course, Virginia settlers are going to move across that border. They're going to develop farms and settlements. And while the region did have some, good harbors by the coast, you don't have a lot of slaves, just based on geography and fewer plantations, unlike South Carolina. And again, since people are coming from Virginia, they're bringing their culture. They're bringing their democratic form to some extent, or elements, across the border. And this is going to be an early foray into representative government. So though North Carolina and South Carolina share a name, they are certainly going to be taking divergent paths early on. And finally, we have the Georgia colony, or last colony here, in English America, to form in 1732. And keep in mind, you're a little under 40 years, or a little over 40 years, before the Declaration of Independence is going to be signed. So Georgia sort of comes a little bit later here, but Georgia is founded by James Oglethorpe. And he has this sort of grandiose idea that he wants debtors to be able to start a new life. And I think you can sort of make a little bit of a comparison to William Penn, who had this grand idea to start a new life, for people in Pennsylvania. But with Oglethorpe, also somewhat utopian in these ideas. You have slavery being illegal, no rum is allowed, and while it is certainly to rid England of its jail debtors, because that's a rather expensive thing, holding a debtor. I mean, how can a person make money to get out of jail if you are in jail? So it's going to be rather expensive for England. But the actual intent was for it to serve as a buffer from Spanish Florida. Remember that the Spaniards are in present-day Florida, and Georgia, of course, is going to be that area that's going to be that buffer to protect the other English colonies. The Georgia population certainly will vary, amongst having debtors, impoverished British craftspeople. You even have religious refugees, believe it or not, from Germany and Switzerland. So certainly you have some diversity in this colony, and this would be an experiment as well. Now, you'll note by this point here that by 1770, all hell rather breaks loose, as nearly half of its population will eventually become enslaved Africans. And this will certainly show that something clearly deviated from Oglethorpe's vision to have outlawed slavery in the first place. But Georgia will certainly change rapidly from its origin and be a major slave-holding colony, despite it being intended to be formed as a buffer against Spanish Florida and ridding England of its jail debtors. So when we sort of just break this all down together by looking at this map here, we've talked about the New England colonies, right? You have self-government coming about in the form of town hall meetings. If you recall, you have the Mayflower Contract. And again, that's not to say that you didn't have a separation of church and state, and that this by no means was a full and complete democracy. Nevertheless, you do see those seeds being developed. And then in the middle colonies here, right, much more diverse, especially since it's originally founded by the Dutch. You have Penn's experiment. You even have a Swedish settlement in present-day New Jersey. So there's a lot more tolerance for other people's differences compared to other English colonies. And then as we talked about with the southern colonies, you have the only one being proprietary, being Maryland, being that safe haven for Catholics. And of course, you have tobacco that's going to be absolutely huge. You also have the House of Burgesses forming early in Virginia and to an extent in Democratic North Carolina. And then you have South Carolina resembling a little bit more of Barbados and introducing sort of that mindset of slavery. And Georgia, which was, of course, intended to be this idea of this new and fresh, start and will eventually descend into slavery. But again, you now have the formation of our 13 colonies. So it is, growing rapidly, and you have a stronger English takeover. And do note, hopefully you already know this, you do not have Maine or Vermont as one of the original 13 colonies. But again, colonies are taking shape here, and they will be very much different demographically, at least early on, culturally, and environmentally. I mean, this is going to affect their way of life, their agricultural practices or fishing practices, depending if you're in New England or even the South. So still some diversity.